Good evening all and welcome. Disclaimer, because the option gangs that sometimes break in that you don't want to meet won the poll, this is indeed that video. However, just to keep things short, obviously the titling and the thumbnail had to be a little bit shorter because it's quite a mouthful. But with that being said, this is exactly what you get. So I hope you enjoy. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Back when I was 18, my mum and I had been doing work in the garden, so she was exhausted and went to bed early. It was winter, so it got dark early. I knew I would be the only one awake for the next few hours until her partner got in from working at 4 a.m. I went about my usual nightly routine. I rolled a joint and went out back to smoke it, as I did every night, as I was not allowed to smoke in the house. The house had 2 floors, and my bedroom was on the top floor. After I had my smoke, I went back upstairs and continued watching whatever. About an hour later, I decided I would have one more joint before going to bed. I finished rolling and got myself ready to head out into the cold. But just before I went down the stairs, something on my phone distracted me, and I sat back on the bed concentrating on that. When a minute or 2 passed, I heard a loud bang from downstairs. I thought to myself it was just my mum's partner coming home. Then seconds later, I realized I didn't hear the front gate open, and didn't hear the taxi pull up outside. I didn't hear the front door open, and my cat is on the bed next to me, so it wasn't him, and my mum was asleep the next door over. So what could that bang possibly be? I grabbed my taser, which funnily enough looks like a Nokia phone, so that my mum also didn't know about it, and stuck it in my dressing gown pocket and go into my mum's room. Normally she's a very light sleeper, but because she was tired from gardening, she slept through the noise. I wake her up and tell her what I've heard. She gets herself ready, grabs a metal pole, and we head downstairs. I insisted on going first because, in all fairness, my mum is like 5'6" and 130 pounds, has multiple sclerosis, and is holding a flimsy metal pole. I figured my taser would be a little better should we encounter anyone. Looking around, everything seems fine. However, the last room we check is the bathroom, which is on the lower ground floor, to find that the window that sits just above the bath is wide open, with one of our 2 bottles of Tresemme shampoo and conditioner, which were on the windowsill, have been knocked into the bath, creating the loud bang. Of course, we're like, how could this happen? The wind, perhaps? Obviously not. We were just really scared and trying to make ourselves feel better. It's 2:30 a.m. at this point, and my mum calls her partner to tell him someone has just tried to break in through the window and to please come home. His response, it's probably just a fox or something. Close it and go back to bed. You're just being paranoid. So we're like, well, you're no help, and we make sure everything is secure and call 101, the UK's non-emergency police, to report it. 5 minutes later, 4 police cars and dogs all turn up. They look around and then come to the door and ask the obvious questions. After doing a walk around the house and area, they come back again and ask if we usually keep our plastic garden chairs under the bathroom window. No. The police advise us that a dodgy gang have been doing strange things about the area, trying to break in through windows and steal whatever they can. They must have taken the garden chairs to stand on to help them get in. The police also advised that a house a few streets over had just been broken into, and everything was taken and the house was destroyed on the inside. I don't think they ever got caught. The thing that freaks me out the most is, had I not got distracted with my phone before going out back to smoke, I would have been outside sitting on the same chairs in the pitch darkness, where the intruders would have come around and seen me, and God knows what would have happened to me, as our outdoor light was broke. So to whoever tried to break into my house that night, let's keep it this way, and never meet. I live in a middle to low class neighborhood in the Caribbean. It's a quiet place where nothing happens. The type of place people go to and retire to sip piña coladas all day. However, a few houses next to mine lived a family that was not like the rest. They had the biggest house on the street and lived luxuriously. Their kids would play with me, especially the smallest girl we all nicknamed Tiny. Tiny was about 5 when I was 11, and she was always at my house. I knew my mom and the neighbors were concerned about a 5-year-old being outside all day and not arriving at her home until midnight on school days. But it was a quiet place where nothing happened, so no one got worried. When Tiny turned 6, her parents threw a giant birthday party for her, and all of the neighborhood kids were invited. I wanted to go. They had bouncy castles, water slides, and everything a kid would want to play with, but my parents didn't allow me to. I never knew why. I suppose it was my mum, as she didn't know her mum. I remember feeling very sad because everyone was there, and there I was alone, playing at home. After the birthday, things went back to normal, and one day we were all playing and talking about what our parents did for work. We asked Tiny and her siblings, but none of them knew what they did, except he traveled a lot and was always in meetings. I didn't pay much attention, and we all continued on with our day. One night we were playing on the street when we started hearing loud pops coming from Tiny's house. I'll never forget that day. The neighbors, including my mum, came out rushing us inside yelling it was gunshots. Some of us got into my house and we stayed there as the next door neighbor, a cop, ran towards Tiny's house. All we saw after the gunshots were a black van rushing down the street and almost killing a dog. Some men entered the house. Tiny and her siblings wanted to check what was going on, but everyone forbade them to go. All I remember was a bunch of cops and ambulances a few minutes later, and after that day, I never saw Tiny or her siblings again. For a few months the house sat empty. Black vans with strange men kept coming into the neighborhood door to door, asking for any information about the man and his children. No one in the neighborhood spoke about it. I knew the cops asked me about Tiny and the kids, and if they ever said something weird about her dad and mum, but I was only 11 and more concerned about playing Mario Kart on the Wii than what happened that night. Years passed and the story faded away. Now that I'm grown up, I asked my neighbor, the cop, what went down that night, as there were rumors the guy died. He said that night the man got a gun emptied into his skull, and his wife was gravely wounded but survived, because he was a drug lord that was going to make a deal with the police to turn his rival gangs and some other people to the cops. The men in the van that were going door to door wanted to know where his kids and wife were, to also shut them up. As to his kids, his eldest son was found a few hours away in a neighboring town, his car set ablaze. He didn't survive. His other children are now living in other countries under witness protection programs. I just hope, wherever Tiny is, she's doing okay, and her family got the help they needed. I catered at a family reunion for 200 people. I knew from the very start there was going to be problems because no one wanted to pay the remainder of the bill. 50% deposit to hold the date was already received and cashed, but no one had a plan on how to pay the remainder, so I told them that I wasn't putting the food out until I received payment. About an hour and a half passed, and I had collected most of the remaining cash, about $3,000, and someone wrote a check for a couple of $100 to cover the rest, which bounced and took 4 months to recover. Once the food goes out, everyone seems happy, except the event space owners who were super shady from the beginning. We are actually at the second location that they own because the first wasn't available. Classic bait and switch. Anyway, the venue owner tells me that the space is booked for a second event that starts in half hour. Personally, I don't care because I got paid and just wanted to gather my equipment and leave. I come to find out the second group is a college fraternity that had gotten kicked off campus for violence, so they throw their parties elsewhere. I told my team to leave. Don't clean up, don't help me pack up, just leave now. The frat boys are already starting with their family group reunion, and no one is remotely close to prepared to leave the family reunion. I grab all my equipment after hiding the cash in my truck and take off without saying a word. By the time I got home about 35 minutes later, there's a shooting in the local news. 2 dead, 4 in critical condition from the venue that I just left. When I was 16, I had just gotten my first car and had it about 3 weeks. This guy walks up to me at a gas station and asks to use my phone. Naive and trying to be nice, I let him use it, but he walks away for a minute and then walks back out with an older guy. I didn't know at the time, but he had taken my SIM card out my phone. Then, they get into the back seat of my car. A friend of mine was in the front, and he asks if I will give them a ride up the street. At this point I was kind of nervous and just wanted them gone, so I thought this would get rid of them. It was literally like a minute drive to this bar, so I figured okay, let me just do what they want and hopefully they'll be gone. They were kind of intimidating, especially to 16-year-old me, but as I started to drive he says, "Take this right, go down this road," which happened to be on the road I live on. So I thought, cool, I'll drop him off and go home. Well, I get to the house he wanted to go to, but then the other guy, who looked a bit scary looking, gets into my car again, and they say, "Take us to Wendy's and bring us back." It was about 5 minutes away, so I figured I would get these guys their Wendy's and that would be it. So I take them through the drive-thru, get food and start to head back to my house. But he says, "No, take us up the street." At this point I tell them, "Is this it? I need to be getting home." And he's like, Yeah, just drop us off. It's like 5 minutes away." I still haven't got my phone back, and I was too scared to ask at this point. And that's the least of my worries, really. I drive and get to this dirt road, really freaking out now. We come to an area surrounded by trees, kind of a big circle and big enough to turn around, so I start to turn around because there are no houses. At this point he reaches up from the back seat and throws my car into park and grabs me. My friend jumps out and tries to run, but one of the other guys sees him and hits him, but got away. It was dark and hard to see. He then pulls out a firearm and tells me to get out. I'm really scared, thinking that I'm about to lose my life. He hits me in the mouth with the gun and tells me to give him everything. I had some money in my pockets that I hand to him. Then they all get into the car and drive off. I'm miles away from anywhere and start walking. No phone, freaking out. I called out my friend's name and didn't hear anything. I walked a few miles to a gas station and cops are there. I guess my friend made it there and called, and I called my dad and told him what happened. It was the scariest moment of my life, and I should be dead. My face was all busted up when we got to the police station. We tell them everything. They think we were buying drugs from these guys and are trying to get me to tell them who it was. Then they pull out a book of pictures. After half hour I see one of them who hits me. I knew it was him and instantly told them. A few weeks later I heard that he had stolen another car, got pulled over, ends up stealing a cop's car and is chased down. He gets out and tries to cut across a train track with a train coming and falls, and it severed his leg. Justice was served, I guess, but it doesn't end there. Years later I saw him at a bar on crutches, hobbling around, and I was satisfied. Then a few years later he got hit by a car one night, and that was it. I know this is hard to believe, and whether anyone believes me or not, I don't care. It's very true, and I've always felt I should be dead. But I'm not, and he is. So to the guy who almost ended my life, I know we won't meet again. New Year's Eve in Moscow. I was a dark-haired, dark-skinned man and was drinking with my significant other, who's a blonde woman. We're in a bar getting friendly with some locals who try their best to speak English, so friendly that one of us gave us a matryoshka doll that he was going to give to his mother later that night. They seemed a little too friendly, and maybe they just were that, but at one point I went to order more drinks and the bartender who'd been watching and serving us gave me a stern look and said, "You should leave. No." I found this a little strange and unexpected, so naturally tried to question what he meant, but his face was drop dead serious. He looked at the friendly group, then at my girlfriend and then to me and repeated the words. I didn't really want to take any chances in Russia and wanted to see another bar anyway, so I grabbed my girl, the doll, and promptly left. Apparently, they had marked us to be taken. The steps, apparently, of what I've heard, are befriend tipsy foreign tourists, give them a distinct brightly coloured object to hold onto, and wait for them to become increasingly drunk. Make up an excuse to go outside either for a smoke or to go another bar, and watch as your crew waiting outside see the marked object, put bags over your new friend's head and push them into the waiting car. I'm very lucky, unbelievably lucky, that the bartender wasn't in on it. He recognized the doll straight away. I had recently moved into my own place. I was 19, and this was because my ex-stepdad was constantly being emotionally abusive towards me and my mum. I'm a female. I moved into a council estate in the northeast of England. Before moving into the house, I was warned it was a rough area. I was given the weekend to think over whether I wanted to move here. Over that weekend, I visited the house at random times throughout the day to see what the activity in the area was like. I decided it didn't seem too bad, as I was moving there to have a place to live and not make friends. I lived there for about a year and never had anyone bother me really, apart from one night. Let me describe the layout of this house a little bit. It was a 2-bedroom house with a back garden, with the gate to get to the back garden being on the right of the front door, which I always kept padlocked. My bedroom was above the front door with a window facing the front door and side gate. I also had a drive, which my car was parked on. I had recently started working day shifts as opposed to nights, so my sleeping was pretty messed up at the time, and I would fall asleep pretty early on in the night. On this particular night, I was in bed at 9 p.m. and started watching a show on Netflix and fell asleep pretty quickly. Around 11:30, I was awoken to a loud banging. I stayed in bed and hoped it would just be a one-time thing, but then the banging proceeded and I could hear shouting. I can't remember what was being said as I was pretty freaked out. Living by myself and no reason for anyone to be knocking at my door. Then, while someone proceeded to bang on the front door, loud enough to sound like they could have broken it down, another of the party started to shake on the side gate, which fortunately was padlocked. I then rang my mum, who was on night shift at the time, and answered quickly. I was crying, and quickly filled her in on what was going on. She stayed on the phone with me throughout the rest of the ordeal. I don't know how or why, but I got the courage to peek outside from behind the curtains and could see 2 blokes, probably in their late 20s to early 30s. They looked like chavs, dressed in tracksuits, and don't look very friendly. At this point, I'm pretty sure they're heavily intoxicated, with either booze, drugs, or both. After this is carrying on for about 20 minutes, I realize they're not going to stop unless I said something. So me being brave and perhaps a little stupid, I opened my bedroom window. I shouted down to them, "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Now I can't remember the names they said, maybe Steve. The one who had been banging on the door said, "Get Steve out of here now." Me being confused because obviously I lived by myself, and I said, "Who's Steve?" Then the guy replied, "I know he's there, his car's there." Bear in mind at the time I was a 19-year-old with a Toyota Corolla with a private reg. For obvious reasons I won't share the reg, but to put it simply, the plate is an abbreviation of my name, so obviously this Steve guy wasn't going to have my car with a girl's name on his plates. I replied to this guy and was like, "No, that's my car." He then proceeds to ask my name. Stupidly, I gave him my first name, but not my last. And then he asked, "Who lives here then?" I stupidly reply, "Just me." But thankfully after this remark, his friends, who had been trying to get inside my side gate, were like, "It's time to go." I watched as they walked down the street away from my house, until they were out of sight. To make sure they weren't going to come back, I rang the police and made a statement in case they did return. Thankfully that was the first and last time I saw them. Me being forgetful sometimes, I would forget to lock my doors. Thankfully that night, I had locked my front door because if I hadn't, I have no idea what would have happened. So to the creepy, intoxicated men, let's not meet again. One of my best friends and I met back when we were 10 in the 4th grade, 2009. A common theme in our friendship was horror. We both laughed and got off immediately watching and playing scary video games together. At the time, it was Secure, Contain, Protect on his laptop. Fast forward until the summer of senior year in high school. We drive up to this area of New Jersey called Hope Township. Real desolate farmland area, very few people out there. There's an area of road called Shades of Death that we've looked into for years that we're sure we'd eventually go to. So we drive up one time, just me and him. It's about an hour's drive from where we are in New Jersey. I remember it was rainy and extremely misty, this one chilly July night. We get there about 9 p.m. We're rolling down this long 10-mile desolate road when we spot a car going at 15 miles an hour in front of us. Keep in mind, these are rural New Jersey roads, with 40 miles an hour being the speed limit, and high beams are acceptable. We start going at their pace to match them, and I keep telling him how weird this is as we're driving. He looks at his phone for a few minutes, saying they're probably just some old people, but then we see a kid around our age turn his head from the back seat and stare at us absolutely fixated. My eyes have been glued to the road, so I decide to point this out to my friend. I also realized the car was packed with teenagers, with 3 other heads turning to stare at our car. My friend then says he feels bad about this, as another car is suddenly right behind us, also matching our speed. I get it was off, but I really didn't think just about how dangerous the situation could have been until the next day after we both went home, after my boy crashed at my house. I eventually pass the car in front of us and speed up to lose sight of them and peel off into a desolate rundown parking lot and turn off my lights so they wouldn't see where we'd gone. We both wait for them to pass and agree it's strange. When we went back up the road to go explore the state reserve, Jenny Jump State Forest, which is another story entirely. The next day we hear on the news that MS-13 gang members brutally ended the life of innocent people in the area walking through the forest with hatchets. To this day we still reflect on how badly the situation could have gone, and we are honestly curious to return. And we have. So to those kids on Shades of Death Road, whoever you are, let's not meet. When I lived in England, I was a regular, and then DJ at a goth club, running at a functioning church in Greater Manchester. The caretaker and artist in residence was a kind guy who loved industrial music, pink mohawks and fire breathing. How the vicar decided to allow a goth night once a month in his church is a story I never heard, but it's still going strong and is much beloved. One packed night as we drank white wine straight from the bottle, my husband came running in from outside the church. "Call 911, he shouted over whatever Covenant or NVM Nation song was pumping at the time. My husband, James, is a calm and collected person, in direct opposite to me, more aggressive, and forthright personality. But this night he looked panicked and frightened. "What's happening?" I asked. "Some people are being attacked." I started to rush towards the front door, as I knew a lot of my friends were outside smoking, but James held me back. "No." To find some quiet, I hid in the ladies' restroom and dialed 999. The call did not go well. "Hi, we need police. My friends are being attacked outside a church." "Where are you?" "Just outside Manchester, at Sacred Grace." "There's no Sacred Grace in Manchester." "Okay, it's just off Deansgate." "There's no Sacred Grace off Deansgate." I shouted into the crowd for the cross streets, and the 911 dispatcher was impatient. "Deansgate and Piccadilly in Salford," someone called back. I relayed that to the dispatcher, who sighed and said, "We'll send someone over," before she hung up. While I was on the phone, people rushed in and barricaded themselves inside. At some point the music was cut, and all 100 of us tried to be as quiet as possible. James told me he was outside with our friends, smoking, when he felt a fist go past his head. Another friend was punched in the back, and the other smokers all rushed inside and closed the door behind them. None of us knew what to do. There were people outside who just randomly jumped a bunch of us outside a church. What the hell? It wasn't before long we heard shouting and crunching, low male voices uttering insults, and we weren't sure what the crunching was. Eventually there was silence and someone opened the door. We thought everyone had got inside, but we were wrong. One of the organizers, Jason, laid on the ground with pools of blood around him. An ambulance had arrived and there were 2 paramedics. One had an oxygen tank in hand and shouted at the bystander, who lit back up. At this point it's a blur as to what happened after we watched Jason being carted away to a Manchester hospital. We were all shaken up and scared. From other scraps I heard the men who were outside said that they wanted to mess up some freaks, in their words. I refused to let a bunch of scallies scare me away from a night I'd really grown to love, so we showed up the next month and the next, until the horrible night where Jason was beaten so badly his jaw had to be wired shut was just a story. In my regular life, I've always looked average. I'm tallish with blonde hair and blue eyes. I had weirdly coloured hair once when I was a teenager, and I dyed it bright green, manic panic. But as much as I loved my goth nights and horror, I also had a day job. I worked as an IT person in a nice building in a nice part of Manchester, and I had to blend in. At the weekends, I wore too much vinyl and high spiked boots with too much makeup, and during the week I wore Zara slacks and sweaters and no makeup at all. The church wasn't just used for goth nights and weekly services, it also hosted other events. The artist in residence, Dave, put together, like art shows, and because we were regulars, we frequently were roped into helping out, serving drinks and clean up and provide soundtrack. One night, Dave and others in the congregation were exhibiting various paintings and sculptures and mixed media pieces. James and I were summoned to pull prints and pour wine for the attendees. It's actually thanks to this night I know how to pour a pint with not a lot of head. I wore a black work dress, slacks and a pink top. My hair was blown out and makeup was subtle. James wore jeans and a nice shirt. We had to look nice-ish because the mayor of Salford was going to be there. Art night closed, the mayor and her office assistant left. We cleaned up and I went outside with my pink mohawk. Dave and my husband were outside smoking, and we stood and made small talk until a man approached us. My heart pounded with fear, but I wasn't initially sure why. He didn't look like anything. He was probably 6 foot bald and wearing a t-shirt, jeans and sneakers. He was holding a bag soaked with grease from the chippy around the corner, and I was afraid of him. I wanted to run, but was sure that we would have somehow been worse than just pretending like things were still normal. "What's going on here then?" He nodded at the door. I exchanged glances with James. "Just a night thing for the church," James said. "Oh yeah? None of them freaks nights again?" That's it, I thought to myself. He's the one. I hadn't seen any of the men that attacked my friends, but I knew in my soul this was one of them. I hoped that my business casual bartender outfit meant he wouldn't connect us. A freak night? No, just an art night the church put on. I keep my voice steady and try to keep my cigarette from shaking in my hand. Dave had been silent and said, "I should go talk to the vicar." He emphasized vicar. He probably hoped it would keep this thug calm. We nodded and stood in front of the door after it closed to hopefully prevent our visitor from following Dave. The man grinned at us. "Did you hear what happened? A bunch of people got messed up here a while back." I flicked my cigarette onto the street. "Oh yeah? That sounds awful." His smile broadened, showing gaps where his teeth should have been. "I heard they got a right kicking." My husband had cracked the door, and I stepped back towards the gap. James moved with me to go inside. Neither of us wanted to turn our back on him. Everything about this man seemed dangerous, and we felt things escalate. We may have blended in, but it seemed like reliving what he'd done was making him want to do it again. "Oh, and I was there," he bellowed, the last part, his knuckles white on his takeaway bag, his other hand clenched. Rage lit up, and his eyes and body were tense. In one quick motion, we both went back inside. The huge and thankfully heavy wooden door closed behind us, and the man pounded his fists on them until he grew tired. Thankfully, he was too stupid, not interested enough, or too hungry to wait for us to go home. I don't know if the police ever investigated what happened, but Jason never returned after having his jaw wide shut. The night petered out a little bit just after this, but it's still growing strong now many years later. As far as I know, nothing like that ever happened again, and the man with the chips didn't ever return during any of the other events we volunteered at, or otherwise attended. It is a little known fact that when you relinquish your phone number, it can be redistributed after a while. And I think the person who had my phone number before me was both a deadbeat and in with the wrong crowd, because I constantly got harassed by credit industries looking for this guy Juan, who isn't me, and I get crazy texts asking for Juan. This was normal in the beginning, and over time it started to die down. After having my phone number for 6 years, I was getting a call from this strange number with my same area code, but they were calling every 5 to 10 minutes. Normally I would block it, but it was the same number, every time. So I was going to wait to Google the number to verify it was spam. Before I could get to Google, I get a text from the number that was calling me earlier that simply was saying a swear word in Spanish. Now, I'm white, but I knew what it meant. Usually at this point, I would just ignore it, then block the message, but I was intrigued because it wasn't a message promising me Russian hot singles in my area or any spam like that. So I decided to Google some Spanish comeback/insult and proceeded to barrage the messenger with some salty Spanish lingo. Needless to say, the messenger was less than thrilled with my response. This was when this went from amusing to straight-up harassment. Later that day, I received threats in my texts and constant calls. I tried in English, saying I'm not Juan and that I was just messing around. This didn't seem to work as they kept saying things like, "Liar, I know it's you, stop trying to hide." I was bored at this point and blocked their number. And the next day, I get a text from a different number in Spanish telling me to watch myself and "You're dead." I decided to ignore this and blocked the numbers again. For a few weeks nothing happened. I figured they must have figured out that I wasn't this Juan they were looking for, but then I get a text, this time with a picture. I would have dismissed it, but the picture made me queasy. It was a picture of a tattooed man holding a piece of paper with my phone number, Juan's full name and address that thankfully wasn't mine, with a message saying in Spanish, "We're coming." What made the picture worse was that the man had a tattoo on his face that said MS-13 below his eye. At that time I had decided that I had enough and decided to change my number at that point. It makes some sense as I was in a different state anyway. I didn't do anything past this because deep inside, I was hoping this was just a bad joke that was being played on either me or Juan. But if not, I hope they didn't find this Juan guy, or that they find me for that matter. It gives me hope that they didn't have my address, and 2 years since this happened, I haven't heard a peep. I went to post-secondary school in a very large, well-known American city. In my time there, nearly everyone I knew was eventually robbed or assaulted. Many of the stories were appalling and altogether frightening. I thought I was insulated by self-awareness, but I was wrong. When I moved to this city, it was a culture shock. Country boy to big city in one night. The learning curve was steep. I lived in a large, semi-enclosed city centre. Tall apartments housed students from around the world attending a variety of institutions. We had our own mall, art centre, restaurant, etc. in this large complex sitting near the edge of downtown. There were a limited number of exits from our somewhat gated community into the surrounding city. It felt safe. Most students walked several large blocks through a brief industrial section and then crossed a massive bridge into the downtown area, and either entered institutions there or caught mass transit to their destination. Buses, subways, taxis. Midway through my time at school, I was walking home alone one evening. My large portfolio bag, weighed with tools and tablets, hung by my side. It was mid-fall and getting dark quickly. Cool air came down from the hills, but waves of the day heat collected in the concrete and pavement and wafted up and swarmed around me. Coupled with the smell of fall and the energy of the city, it was intoxicating and distracting. To enter the complex from downtown, you need to ascend 2 large wide cement stairways, all the way up the final third set of a very high stair to pass through a mall which loomed above. All around were large planters and girthy pillars. It was a busy-looking large area with benches, curves and hidden spaces. I guess that's why I didn't notice him until I was nearly halfway to the final staircase. Then, suddenly, the appearance of a man in a trench coat, staring at me only 20 or so feet away, snapped me out of my daydream. I was always very alert when moving through the city, having heard many horror stories about students being ambushed by criminal lowlives, but I felt safe here with all the space around me, and had uncharacteristically let my guard down. I gauged the distance, his body language, the possibility that he may have unhealthy motives, and decided to play it cool and keep moving up the steps. If he moved towards me, I would bolt. If not, chalk it up to nerves. I was relieved to start climbing the stairs while he stood still and continued to look at me. I was smug that I was no longer in any danger. I would reach the double doors to the mall and be gone. As the stairs turned near the top, I casually looked back down some 40 feet to the courtyard. He was staring up at me and smiling. Relieved, I reached for the door handle, safety inches away, visible through the large glass doors. But it was dark. I tugged on the door, which refused to open. It was locked. It was later that I thought the mall had closed. Crap. I stood there for a moment, collecting myself. I had to go through the parking garage back down a level. The only other option was to make my way back out to the road and circle the massive complex on an empty sidewalk at night until I found another way in. I still felt very aware of the man in the coat. Would he approach me? Would he corner me? Was he armed? What if he wanted more than money? He looked crazy. And that smile. I pulled myself together and started back down the stairs. I couldn't see him anywhere. Perhaps he left. Without being certain of his motives or location, every step I took gave rise to increasing anxiety. I reached the bottom, moving cautiously, and looked towards the parking entrance. It was a lot of ground to cross, and there was far more cover for my would-be psycho than I was comfortable with. I was frozen, carefully scanning the scene and listening intensely. I was altogether unsure of myself, but needed to make a choice. Without knowing where he had gone, both options before me held equal peril. Back out to the road, into the dark, or forward, past the pillars and planters big enough to conceal him, into the enclosed garage, where no one would hear my shouts of distress. Just as I was about to move, I heard laughter and voices coming from the road. A group of people emerged into the lit area and began climbing the wide stairs facing downtown. I felt a rush of peace, and smiling to myself, I stepped in behind them and began following them towards the garage entrance. I was congratulating myself inwardly for my good fortune and my savvy, my fear melting away. Just as I entered the garage after them, I looked back, and he was there, smiling broadly with his arms buried in the pockets of his trench coat. Our eyes locked, and his broad grin widened further, stretching over his thin lips over his teeth. He was standing right smack in the middle of the entrance I passed merely seconds ago. He must have been hiding behind a pillar that I was only a few feet away from. I looked down at his drab-clothed frame and took notice that his arms appeared to be at his side, despite being in his pockets, which were high up on his waist. I didn't notice how unnatural that looked when I first saw him. His pockets must have been cut through, because I could make out the shadow of an object he seemed to be holding in his hands beneath the coat. So dirty, smiling, criminal lowlife. Let's not meet again. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so very much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's stories about gangs that sometimes break into people's homes that you'd rather not meet. A nice little fusion. Obviously not all of them were that topic, but it was like all three. Honestly, it was a meme option. I wasn't expecting it to win. I was expecting it to get 0 votes. But as it won, yeah, I threw together some of the stories. Some of them, in fairness, were gangs who tried breaking in that you'd rather not meet, but it wasn't possible. I genuinely didn't think it would win. But I hope you liked it nonetheless. I enjoyed recording it. The story about the guy in his car, how he nearly died. Damn, that is a horrible situation to be in. Man. Just always say no. Whenever someone asks you for something and you don't know them, can I borrow your phone? No, straight up. I know it's not the nicest thing to do, but it's the sensiblest thing to do. I remember once actually, I just got back from Spain, and my phone, this was like 9 years ago or something, and I think because I was living out in Spain, I had a Spanish SIM. And when I came back to the UK, I think I'd forgotten my English SIM, or my English SIM didn't have credit or something, or maybe my phone was dead. And I really needed to call my dad because he was picking me up from the airport. And I couldn't get a hold of him. He wasn't, in arrivals. I couldn't see him. And so I went out asking people if I could call my dad using the number because I needed to be picked up. And I asked about 8 different people, and all of them said no. And at the time, I was pretty annoyed. They gave really crap excuses like, oh, I don't have credit. And I was thinking, so few people just get credit nowadays, but whatever. And it really bothered me that people were thinking I was shady and dodgy and stuff. But as the years passed and as I started reading and eventually narrating these stories, I came to realize that to those people, I could have been someone, who could have stolen their phone or whatever. So it makes sense now, upon reflecting. But yeah, to cut a long story short, after asking the 8th person and they said no, my dad walks up and I see him and I'm like, oh great, and we leave. So yes, don't lend your stuff to people you don't know. And there's that other story I read a while back about a guy in South Africa who gives these 2 girls a lift, and then they steal his wallet, and then he catches onto them, and he ends up getting his wallet back, but only after they take all his money. Just don't give people lifts. Don't lend people anything. It's not a nice world where you have to do that, but it's the world we live in, I suppose. Better to be safe than sorry. That's I think, the most important thing. Alright then, well, with that being said, I think it's time to finish off tonight's episode. Thank you everyone so much for watching. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.